Welcome to today's deep dive. We're going to be talking about the diary of a young girl, but today we're looking at it from a literary perspective. So I think most people know the basic history surrounding the book.
Yeah.
But we're going to be focusing on what makes this book so important for anyone who enjoys literature.
Right.
Maybe even for aspiring writers.
Definitely. Yeah, it's interesting because I think a lot of people think about this book and they think about, World War II,
Right.
the Holocaust, which is, of course, hugely important.
Of course.
But there's so much more to this book.
Yeah, one of the things that I find really fascinating about it is that it's considered to be a primary source.
Right.
Which I think is really interesting from a literary perspective. Because a lot of times when we think about literature, we're thinking about, fictional stories or poetry or things like that.
Right.
So can you talk a little bit about what makes the Diary of a Young Girl such a significant primary source document?
Well, I think you hit it on the head when you were saying that, a lot of times we think about, literature as being fiction or poetry or plays or something like that.
Yeah.
But primary sources are also really important in literary studies because they give us that firsthand account.
Right.
They're written by people who actually experienced the events that they're writing about.
Right.
And so you get this sort of unfiltered look at what was going on.
Yeah, and that's what's so powerful about this diary is that you're really getting that firsthand account of what it was like to
live through this horrific time in history.
in hiding.
Right, and you're not getting it from someone who is looking back on it years later. You're getting it from someone who is experiencing it in the moment.
Yeah, it's like we're right there with her.
Exactly, and I think that that's what makes it such a powerful reading experience. Because you're not just learning about the facts of the Holocaust.
Right. You're really feeling the emotional impact of it. You're understanding what it was like for the individuals who were living through it.
Right.
And I think that that's something that, you don't always get from a history textbook.
Right. You get the feeling.
Exactly.
You get that emotional connection. So it's a primary source document, but it's also this really interesting work of literature.
Right.
And one of the things that I think is really kind of unique about it is the way that she addresses her entries to this mysterious kitty.
Right.
And I know that you've done some research on this. So can you tell us a little bit more about who Kitty is and why she's so significant?
So Kitty is actually a really interesting literary device that Anne uses. And it evolved over time. So initially when she first started writing in her diary, Kitty was one of several fictional characters that she would address her entries to.
So she wasn't even writing to just one person.
Not at first, no.
Wow. She was sort of drawing inspiration from these different characters from books that she loved.
Wow. So even from the beginning, she was thinking about literature.
It seems that way, yeah.
Yeah, that's really fascinating.
And then later on, she consolidated all of her entries to be addressed solely to Kitty. And so it becomes this sort of single consistent recipient.
Right. So she's thinking about audience.
Yeah, exactly.
Even at that young age.
And I think it's really interesting because it creates this sense of intimacy. You feel like you're reading a personal letter.
Yeah, you feel like you're part of that conversation.
Right, exactly. And it really draws the reader in.
And then I think that's something that she continues to develop as she continues to write. And one of the things that I think is really interesting is that there was a radio broadcast during the war that called for people to save their diaries and letters. And that seems to have had a really profound impact on Anne. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So after hearing this broadcast, Anne actually started to think about her diary differently. She began to see it as something that could potentially be read by a wider audience.
Wow.
And so she started to revise and expand her entries. And she even started to refer to her diary as a novel.
Wow.
Which I think is really fascinating.
So she was really thinking about herself as a writer.
It seems like it, yeah. And I think that that's something that's really important to keep in mind when we're reading the diary, because it's not just a personal journal. It's also a work of literature that was crafted with a specific audience in mind.
Wow, that's amazing.
And I think it raises some interesting questions about authorial intention, How do writers, even young writers like Anne, make choices about how to shape their message for a particular audience?
Yeah, and we see that, I think, throughout the diary in the way that she talks about the other people who are in hiding with her, the way that she describes her own emotional growth.
Right.
And I think that's something that we're going to delve into a little bit more in the next part of our deep dive.
Absolutely.
But before we move on, I do want to talk a little bit more about Anne's emotional growth, because I think that that's one of the things that makes this diary so compelling, is that we see her changing and growing and evolving as a person.
And it's not just the typical teenage angst.
Right.
You know, it's
amplified by the situation.
Exactly. It's all happening against this backdrop of war and persecution.
Right.
And so it takes on this whole other level of meaning. And I think that that's what makes it so relatable to readers even today. Because even though most of us have never experienced anything like what Anne went through, we can all relate to those feelings of, you know, wanting to be independent and figuring out who we are.
Finding our place in the world.
Exactly. And she does it with such